I've watched a perfectly good carburetor turn into a block of varnish from nothing but bad fuel choices. No crash, no neglect, just gas, sitting where it shouldn't, or coming from a pump that was never going to treat the engine right in the first place. Motorcycles are more exposed to fuel problems than your truck or your car, because most bikes have small tanks, sit for weeks between rides, and a lot of them are still running carburetors that were never built for what's coming out of the pump today. So before your next fill up, here are 8 fuel situations that quietly wreck motorcycle engines, and 2 that actually protect them. Let's get into it. Number 8, any station that isn't top tier certified. This is the foundation of the whole list. So let's get it straight first. Top tier isn't a marketing buzzword. It's a real performance standard created back in 2004 by 4 automakers: GM, BMW, Honda, and Toyota. Since then, the sponsor list has kept growing, and at this point, it covers a dozen major manufacturers, including Ford, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, and Audi. That number has crept up almost every year since the program started, so don't be surprised if it's even higher by the time you're watching this. The point is, this isn't some fringe standard. It's backed by most of the companies actually building the engines you're riding. What it requires is concrete, 2 to 3 times the detergent additive that the EPA's bare minimum demands. And the EPA minimum is just that, a floor, not a target. It was set back in 1995 to stop the worst offenders, not to optimize for engine longevity. Here's why this matters for your bike specifically. AAA ran controlled engine tests and found top-tier fuel cut intake valve deposits by 45 to 72% compared to non-top-tier fuel over a 5,000-mile stretch. Some studies have shown the gap is even bigger, up to 19 times less deposit buildup over the same test conditions. On a motorcycle, where your fuel injectors and intake valves are smaller and more sensitive than a car's, that buildup shows up fast as rough idle, hesitation off the line, and lost throttle response, sometimes within just a few thousand miles of consistent low-quality fuel. The fix costs nothing extra to figure out. Just check toptiergas.com or the Station Finder app before you ride somewhere new, especially if you're touring through unfamiliar territory and don't already know the local stations. If the brand isn't on that list, assume you're getting the legal minimum and nothing more, and plan your fuel stops accordingly. Number 7, stations with low fuel turnover. This one isn't about brand, it's about volume. A gas station that sells a lot of fuel keeps fresh products cycling through underground tanks constantly, sometimes daily. A rural station, a seasonal tourist stop, or anywhere off the beaten path might have fuel sitting in the ground for weeks or even months between deliveries. Ethanol-blended fuel is hygroscopic. It actively pulls moisture out of the air through the vents in those storage tanks, and the longer it sits, the more water it absorbs. Eventually, you hit something called phase separation, where the water-ethanol mixture drops out of suspension and settles at the bottom of the tank, below the gasoline, since it's heavier. If that's the fuel getting pumped into your bike, and remember the pump draws from the bottom of the tank, you're getting a lean, low-quality mix that can run hot and rough, or in bad cases, barely run at all. There's no brand name attached to this risk. It's purely about how fast that specific station moves fuel through its tanks. A busy highway station and a sleepy backroad station from the exact same brand can be selling fuel of very different practical quality, just because of how often the tanker truck shows up. If a pump looks like it hasn't seen a fresh delivery in a while, or the station looks underused, that's your signal to ride on to the next one, especially on a long trip where you're filling up in unfamiliar territory. Number 6, high ethanol blends in a carbureted bike. If your motorcycle has a carburetor, and a huge number of cruisers and classics still do, ethanol is working against you every single ride, not just during storage. Ethanol is a solvent, and carburetors are typically built from zinc, aluminum, and brass alloys that are more vulnerable to corrosion than the fuel injection components in modern cars and bikes. It softens and degrades rubber hoses, float needles, and O-rings that weren't designed with ethanol exposure in mind, which is exactly how you end up with a fuel leak or a sticky float valve that floods the engine. It also changes your air-fuel ratio at a chemical level. Ethanol carries extra oxygen molecules, which leans out the mixture your carb was jetted for on straight gasoline decades ago. That shows up as flat spots, hesitation, and harder cold starts, especially in the small pilot circuits that handle idle and low-speed running, since they don't like ethanol's poor vaporization characteristics at low temperatures. If your bike's manual predates 2010 and you're consistently running standard E10, you're fighting a fuel that simply wasn't part of the original engineering conversation when that carburetor was designed. None of this means you can't run E10. Plenty of riders do successfully for years, but it does mean you should expect more frequent carb cleaning and earlier replacement of fuel system rubber than a rider running ethanol-free fuel. Number 5, letting any ethanol blend sit in the tank for weeks. This is less about which brand you buy and more about what you do after you buy it. Ethanol fuel has a noticeably shorter shelf life compared to ethanol-free gas. We're talking weeks of meaningful degradation, not months. Leave it sitting in your tank and carburetor for a few weeks without running the bike, and you're inviting phase separation, gum, and varnish formation right there in your own fuel system. No contaminated pump required, no bad brand to blame. It's just chemistry doing what chemistry does when fuel sits static and exposed to a vented tank. The fix is cheap and well documented. A fuel stabilizer rated specifically for ethanol blends, run through the entire system, including the carb bowls, before any extended storage. The key step a lot of riders skip is actually running the engine after adding the stabilizer, so the treated fuel makes it all the way through the lines and into the carburetor itself, not just sitting untreated in the tank. Riders who park their bikes for the season without doing this are often the same riders pulling gummed-up float bowls apart in spring, scraping out a hard amber varnish that used to be gasoline, and wondering why the bike that ran perfectly in October won't even turn over in April. Number 4, mixing premium and regular at non-top-tier stations, expecting a quality jump. Here's a myth worth killing, because I hear it constantly from riders trying to do the right thing. At a station that isn't top-tier licensed, paying extra for premium doesn't automatically buy you better detergent protection. Premium usually just means higher octane, which only matters if your engine actually requires it for compression reasons. The top-tier standard, where it applies, covers every octane grade sold at that station equally, from regular all the way to premium. That's actually one of the nicer parts of the program. You don't need to upgrade to premium just to get the cleaning benefit at a certified station. But flip that around at a non-certified station and the logic breaks. A non-top tier station's premium can still be running minimum spec EPA detergent levels, just dressed up at a higher price with a fancier pump label. You're not buying a cleaner engine, you're buying higher octane and nothing else. If your bike doesn't actually need that octane rating, check your manual, most don't. Paying more for premium at a non-top tier pump isn't protecting your engine at all. It's just a more expensive way to get the exact same minimum detergent fuel you'd have gotten from the cheap pump next to it. Number 3, octane higher than your bike actually needs. This isn't a horsepower hack, no matter what the marketing on a racing fuel pump might imply. Running fuel above your compression ratio's requirement doesn't clean your engine better, doesn't make more power, and doesn't protect anything extra. What it can do on an older carbureted bike is shift the burn characteristics in ways the original jetting wasn't tuned for, since higher octane fuel resists detonation differently and burns at a slightly different rate. Check your owner's manual for the actual recommended octane and match it exactly, rather than guessing or defaulting to whatever sounds safest. More expensive isn't automatically more protective. Matching the manufacturer's spec is what actually protects the engine, and anything beyond that is just money spent at the pump for no measurable benefit to your motor. Number 2, ethanol-blended fuel for long-term storage without a plan. If you're parking a bike for winter, ethanol fuel left untreated is one of the most common, entirely preventable causes of spring carburetor rebuilds. Between the moisture absorption, the corrosion of fuel system metals, and the rubber degradation in hoses and seals, a tank of stale E10 can do more damage sitting still than it ever would running down the highway. Either run the tank close to empty and add fresh fuel with stabilizer at restart, or fill it completely with stabilized fuel to limit the airspace where condensation forms. What you don't want to do is leave a half-full tank of plain E10 and walk away for 4 months. Number 1, ignoring the manual's stated octane and fuel type entirely. The single biggest fuel mistake riders make isn't a brand choice. It's never actually checking what the manufacturer specified. Engines are tuned for specific combustion characteristics. Run the wrong octane, ignore an ethanol sensitivity warning for an older carbureted model, or just default to whatever's cheapest at the corner station, and you're stacking risk on every single fill-up, no matter how good or bad that particular pump's fuel actually is. So that's 8 ways riders quietly damage their own fuel systems. And notice none of it required a shady brand or a conspiracy. It's mostly top tier versus non-top tier, fresh fuel versus stale fuel, and ethanol exposure versus protection. Now let's talk about what actually helps. The 2 that protect your engine. Number 2, top-tier certified stations. Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil/Mobil, and Costco among them. These brands are independently licensed and tested to deliver 2 to 3 times the EPA's minimum detergent package across every grade they sell, with the testing paid for by the additive manufacturers and the licensing overseen by the program's administrators, not self-reported by the gas companies. Chevron's Techron additive and Shell's nitrogen-enriched detergent system are 2 of the most established formulas in the industry, with decades of use behind them. Costco's combination of top-tier certification and genuinely high fuel turnover, given how much volume those warehouse locations move, means you're getting both the detergent benefit and the freshness benefit stacked together, which is part of why it consistently gets singled out by independent testers as one of the better values at the pump. If you only remember one piece of advice from this whole video, it's this. Check the top tier list before you assume any 2 stations are selling you the same quality of fuel, because they're often not, even when the prices look identical. Number 1, ethanol-free gasoline wherever you can find it, especially for storage. If you're running a carbureted or older bike, or you know it's going to sit for weeks at a time between rides, ethanol-free fuel sidesteps almost every problem on this list at once. No phase separation, no extra corrosion risk to your carb internals, no moisture pulling itself out of the air into your tank while the bike sits in the garage. It typically costs more per gallon, and it's not available at every station. You may need to look it up ahead of time using a site like pure-gas.org or a similar resource. But for a bike that spends real time parked, it's some of the cheapest insurance you'll ever buy compared to the cost of a carburetor rebuild, a new fuel pump, or replacing corroded fuel lines. None of this requires guessing or trusting a brand's reputation based on a logo or a feeling. It's all things you can verify yourself in 2 minutes before you ride. Check the top tier list, know your bike's actual octane requirements straight from the owner's manual instead of assuming, and treat any fuel that's going to sit for more than a few weeks like it needs help, because the chemistry says it does. That's the real difference between a bike that still runs clean at 50,000 miles and one that's constantly fighting its own fuel system for reasons the owner never quite figured out. Drop a comment if you've dealt with a phase separation horror story of your own. I read every one of them. And if this saved you from a future carburetor rebuild, that's exactly what this channel is for. Ride smart, and I'll see you in the next one.